Short stories from Japan, accompanied by animation. Reading Japan. The Masked Funeral by Hayashi Jyouji. In the previous chapter, the story takes place in the near future when humans have figured out how to coexist with the coronavirus. The protagonist of the story, Kagawa Misaki, is a temp worker who has returned to his hometown for the first time in 2 decades to get his deceased parents' affairs in order. He takes a job as a funeral proxy to pay for the vaccine he needs to renew his immunity passport. The proxy attendees all wear masks to attend the funeral.
The experience of multiple pandemics had changed society in many ways. Anticipation of lockdowns and travel restrictions had resulted in human contact being kept to an absolute minimum in some areas. At the same time, it had prompted the rise of trends and services catering to people's desire for intimate connection, the kind they would have had during more ordinary times. It wasn't uncommon for people to use matching apps to find partners who were verified safe, someone with whom they could enjoy short-term cohabitation. Unfortunately, in order to be verified as a safe partner, you usually also needed to have a monthly income above a certain threshold, which meant that I, naturally, had never used the service and lived alone in an apartment. As housing situations changed, so did general marital practices. Fewer and fewer people were getting married, but common law unions were on the rise. Back when I lived in my hometown, there was still a place for the tradition of commuting to school and learning in a classroom. But society had since reconsidered the idea of school education predicated on classroom attendance. Before, so much depended on just passing entrance exams to get into high school or university. Now, it was exit exams that held the most value. The conventional classroom-based education system had been in place for more than 150 years. But as pandemics gradually became normalized in the 21st century, the system reached its breaking point and collapsed. The saved cost of education, reduced through applying IT, was now apparently contributing to a rise in the birth rate. Meanwhile, funeral arrangements had also changed with the times. Due to many years of birth rate decline and less disposable income, the practice of holding elaborate funeral services had fallen in number. Multiple pandemics had only accelerated that trend. Now, it was not uncommon to learn of the death of a friend or acquaintance from a notice sent by the family once the ashes had been laid to rest. Although funerals were in decline, they had not yet totally disappeared. Depending on the situation or the social standing of the deceased, the occasion sometimes called for an elaborate funeral. Even more so, because pandemic measures meant that fewer events were taking place in regional cities in general. In rural areas, funerals for eminent locals tended to be grand affairs. at a time when society was tending to hold off on large-scale events, safety-conscious funerals were an opportunity for people in rural areas to get together. Food orders would be placed with local restaurants, people would gather, and money would be spent. At some large funerals, vendors would even set up shop in front of the funeral hall. That being said, it was the age of pandemics, and it was becoming socially unacceptable to hold large gatherings for both the wake and the funeral. So recently, people either omitted the wake altogether or just kept it to family, inviting others only to the formal funeral. That meant the funeral itself became even more of a full-blown event. At the same time, it was becoming increasingly difficult to travel across prefectural borders. So, it was often impossible to physically attend funerals outside the area where you lived. That led to the development of the funeral proxy service. Clients could have a complete stranger don mourning dress, put on what resembled a fencing mask, and attend the service on their behalf. The client's face would be displayed on the surface of the mask using texture mapping technology. And the onboard camera and mic transmitted live video and audio over the internet. In this way, people miles away could use VR to attend a funeral from the comfort of their homes. Meanwhile, the funeral hall would be full of anonymous figures in digital masks offering flowers and burning incense. Basically, it was like operating remote-controlled robots in a field like space exploration or the decommissioning of a nuclear reactor. They only needed people like me because significant technological hurdles made it difficult to rely on a robot to attend a funeral. Plus, social conventions held that funerals should be attended by real flesh and blood humans. The clients could remotely experience the event via the video and audio from my mask. But aside from the exchange of greetings and pleasantries, they couldn't control my actions. That being said, when it came to funeral services, the industry had already established standard etiquette and protocol, and I was familiar with what was expected of me. Whether the attendee was the person themselves or a proxy, the what and the when of expected actions were pretty much set in stone. Yes, you could greet others, but even so, the situations that called for that were limited. At a funeral, attendees were basically backup dancers who followed a script and directed attention to the deceased. This was especially true in cases where the deceased was a particularly eminent local, as video of the service might be streamed online. Given the way things were in society at large, funeral homes and their staff actually preferred proxies to ordinary attendees. For one thing, proxies wore masks that covered their entire faces. This meant that risk of infection wasn't a concern, and they wouldn't have a cluster on their hands. Proxies also increased the likelihood that proceedings would go off without a hitch. I hadn't attended my own parents' funeral, but I had gone to a number of other funerals as a proxy. Simply put, the job paid well. Plus, I was relatively tall, and unlike my junior high school days when I was an easy target for bullies, I was now in shape. So, I was a prime candidate for a proxy. Of course, clients weren't choosing me for my personality. They were merely looking to put their faces onto an above-average frame that possessed a degree of poise. For this trip, I had kept my personal belongings to a minimum, but I always traveled with morning attire in anticipation of occasions like these. With wedding proxy jobs, you had several months' notice and could arrange to rent the appropriate formal wear. But funerals, by nature, were unpredictable. And when it came to securing high-paying gigs like these, responsiveness was everything. There was only one thing you had to remember with funeral proxy gigs. You had to arrive at the venue on time. So, the only real preparation needed was to check the route to the funeral hall. The identity of the deceased was none of my concern. All I had to do was follow the directions from my smartphone's AI system. The funeral hall was about a 30-minute walk from my parents' house. The town only had one of them, so there was no mistaking the venue. I could have put on my proxy mask at any point along the way. But walking around town with my face exposed was something I wanted to avoid if I could. I masked up as soon as I left the house and kept it on as I made my way to the venue. My hometown had felt bleak and empty the previous day, but this morning was different. Although I was the only person around when I left the house, there was a sudden increase in the number of people as I approached the station. Bus service in the area was sparse, but I saw swarms of men and women in proxy masks and mourning attire getting off each bus I encountered. What's more, I saw other similarly masked and dressed up individuals piling out of buses that apparently had been hastily put into service specifically for the occasion. It appeared the deceased was quite the person of influence. I estimated that the local population had temporarily increased by 50%. I'd known that provincial funerals were big occasions, and the scene around the funeral hall only reinforced that notion. The street was lined with food trucks emblazoned with the names of the town's otherwise shuttered establishments. They sold hot dogs, fried chicken, and the like. Many proxies had stopped to grab a bite to eat. The masks for these types of social occasions were designed to allow the wearer to eat and drink without removing them. I also saw many local mourners making use of the trucks. But for one reason or another, they had all decided to eat in small groups, conspicuously avoiding the trucks with proxies in front of them. Among the food truck owners and the customers they were chatting with, I saw a few faces that were vaguely familiar. It seemed that out here, friendships among old school chums carried weight into adulthood. In contrast, the proxies were nothing but faceless outsiders to these people. Some of the proxies chose to display advertisements on their masks. In the city, it was common for texture mapping surface of masks to be used as an advertising medium. Although the pay-per-impression rate was low, the masks could gather and transfer metadata, so as long as you could get enough eyes on you, it provided a decent amount of extra income. Judging by how much business the food trucks were getting, it certainly seemed like a good advertising opportunity. Even a town like this had its eminent, wealthy local figures. And if you were an influential figure in a rural area, you almost certainly had connections outside of the region. The scale of this particular funeral and the large gathering of mass proxies attested to that. The next thing I knew, I'd arrived at the funeral hall. I stopped in my tracks when I saw the name of the deceased displayed at the entrance. remembering the late Kugayama Shintaro. I couldn't believe it. In that moment, I was struck not by feelings of resentment or jubilation. I was simply taken aback. This man was the reason I'd left home for the city, and he was one of the reasons I'd never returned. He was also partly why I'd opted to wear a mask on my way there, so that nobody recognized me. Kugayama was the eldest son of a prominent local family with a legacy dating back centuries. It was hard to imagine a single family exercising so much influence over a region. This was 21st century Japan, after all, and feudalism had supposedly died a long time ago. I was sure that in the cities and even in many rural areas, that sort of local influence was considered archaic. But there were places where that wasn't the case, and the Kugayama family was a prime example. Originally wealthy landowners, they had managed to effectively maintain their influence through various business endeavors. This was largely thanks to the fact that they were longtime supporters of powerful politicians in the ruling party. Around the time I'd left for the city, population outflow had become a significant regional issue. But for the Kugayama family, it was a boon. They'd bought up land from farmers who had lost their livelihood and expanded their own operations. Then they had hired those same failed farmers as contingent workers, making a profit in the process. They'd leveraged their political connections to secure contracts for supplying produce to the urban restaurant industry. And apparently, they'd even started expanding their sales channels overseas. One person described it as the piston effect of regional economies. As you suck the air out of the sealed cylinder, the temperature inside drops. But if you have a piston compressing that air, that small volume of gas heats up. Similarly, even if a regional economy as a whole is impoverished, if the wealth can be concentrated in the hands of a few, you get a small subset of affluent locals. Kugayama Shintaro was the head of one such distinguished household. He had attained power and glory by virtue of the pressure cooker of regional society. That much was evident from the scale of the funeral. But it wouldn't be fair of me to dismiss the large attendance as the result of the vested interests of the community, rather than the personal popularity of the deceased. Kugayama Shintaro had been a high academic achiever, a gifted athlete, and a student council officer. In other words, he was like the protagonist of a cheesy coming-of-age drama. He had been popular and respected, and was a perfect gentleman with male and female friends alike. But the people that fell outside his inner circle were another story. To Kugayama Shintaro, if you weren't a friend, you weren't even human. He could walk all over you without consequence. Kugayama tormented people like us almost to the point of depravity. Reading Japan to be continued.
At the funeral hall, the protagonist recalls incidents of being bullied by the deceased Kugayama Shintaro. Outrage wells up within Kagawa Misaki, and he hatches a plan to get revenge right there at the funeral hall. What's going to happen at the funeral hall packed with locals?